I started growing plants as a hobby for over 20 years. It started when I moved into Chippy Gardens. Basically, those were houses that SLA sort of leases out on, and every house has a plot of land. So I think that was a time where I got quite a lot of inspiration to do something with that plot of land, especially when you look around the community in the area. There were a lot of pretty nicely done up gardens, you were kind of inspired to do something similar. So I think that's when I sort of really started to get an interest. And then I basically moved, went to the different nurseries to see what was available. I would get ideas and inspirations from books and sometimes online, although 20 years ago, the social media didn't exist. So it was a lot harder. But yeah, you get ideas from there, and then you sort of, kickstart that journey. So I started out with gingers. It is not a very popular group of plants to grow. But for me, I think it was interesting because I like anything with sort of lush foliage. And one thing about gingers is that it's quite a large family of plants with different genus. And because of that, there were many different interesting sort of forms and colors, and especially when it flowers. The flowers are pretty fascinating and unique. So I mentioned earlier that I enjoy growing gingers, right? Especially the costas. So I grow quite a lot of costas. I would say there are about 60 different ones in this garden. They don't always bloom, but when they do, then they produce nice, cones like this. Sometimes produce yellow cones like this. Or the shape can be different, right? Like this. So another one here, also different, like this. This one is also another one. Has never bloomed, but it's an interesting one because it is really rare. I think the area that it was found has been decimated. It's become cow pasture. So I think the ones that you can find are mainly found in people's collections. They're no longer found in the wild, right? And you can see that it's got interesting cups on its stem. So one of the things I've done with costas is actually to hybridize them. I've managed to hybridize 2, and I also got them registered. Yeah, so after gingers, then I started moving on to bromeliads. Probably in 2006, I think that was the first time I've ever seen a bromeliad at the World Farm. They brought it in, and it was interesting to me because it had that interesting form, with a central cup that collects water. In those days, I didn't think about, I don't think dengue was prevalent then, so I didn't think so much about, the fact that it could breed mosquitoes. I just thought that, this is really intriguing, right, to see a plant that collects water in the middle. And then I started to read up and find out more about them, and I realized, there are so many types of bromeliads out there with, very interesting colors, and the hybrids are even more fascinating. So these are the bromeliads that I was talking about. I put them outside because they've gotten so big, I don't really have space to put them indoors. So here's some of them, like these, we call them the giants of bromeliad world. It's called alcantarias, right? And they can actually grow much larger than this, but because they're in a pot, so it keeps their size in control. But yeah, there are different forms, variegation. Some are a little bit more blue. So over the years, I have collected many different types of plants, and as mentioned earlier, many different groups of plants. So it really depends on the type of plant and the sort of area they are endemic to. So for example, one of the group of plants I collect are cycads. So cycads are a very old, ancient group of plants that can be found mainly in Africa, but you can also find quite a bit of them in sort of Asia. So the difference between the two, I would say, is in the Asian cycads, they're mostly green. So quite a few of them I had to import from licensed sellers because cycads are protected by CITES, right? And basically, CITES prevents people from randomly selling plants so as to curb poaching, right? So what they do is only certain types of sellers are allowed to sell, and only those with CITES certification are allowed to sell. The other source would be to grow them from seed. So I would also get them from this guy. It's a company called Rare Palm Seeds, right? Online, and you can find him. It's based in Germany, and he sells a lot of seeds. And you can find quite a lot of cycad seeds online, and you can select them, and then you can ship them. It takes forever to grow, but again, there's a sense of satisfaction. Bromeliads are mainly South American plants, so I usually bring them in via sellers or nurseries in America. So pretty big nurseries like Tropiflora, Michael's Bromeliads, they are known around the world for being sort of bromeliad sellers and wholesalers. Yeah, I think with social media, it has definitely helped with getting access to these plants. I think in the past, when we talk about 15, 20 years ago, when I first started out, it's really just getting them from the nurseries, right? The idea of bringing in plants from even Malaysia and Thailand was kind of remote, because you worry about all the kind of paperwork that you have to deal with, and you really didn't know what sort of contacts. Those days you wouldn't even want to pay by credit card online, so payment also was an issue. But these days it's so easy, right? You have PayPal, you have some people even accept crypto. So I think the landscape for the so-called marketplace for plants has changed. Has definitely made it so much easier. Garden planning is it's a tricky thing. I would have an idea in mind, and I will probably get inspiration either from something I've seen online, or from one of these garden books. Yeah, so where I place the plants really would depend on the sort of conditions that it requires. So obviously sun-loving plants have to be in an area where they get exposed to sun. So cycads, the blue cycads, because they are mainly from Africa, in areas where very dry, I would have to put them in very, very exposed areas. So even in the monsoons, they are still okay, because they're in a very exposed area. As soon as the sun comes up, they'll dry up. So definitely, knowing the sort of requirements for each plant is important in deciding where you want to put them, right? Similar with aroids. I think a lot of anthurium growers would not put them in very, very bright conditions, as opposed to philodendrons, which actually prefer more sun. So you kind of have to know and then adjust accordingly. So this is the place that gets the most sunlight throughout the day, practically, most time of the day, right? So I would put the plants that are, need sun right here, because of the constant light that you get. So mainly the succulents. So you see the sort of tall succulent trees. These are euphorbias, right? They get a lot of sun. Obviously, the bromeliads, the terrestrial bromeliads, like these, Dickeas, Hectaeas. These are the ones that are mainly found in Brazil. A lot of them grow in rock crevices, on cliffs, in very sort of harsh conditions. So that's why they look like this. But surprisingly, they can also take a lot of water, right? Despite looking a little bit like a cacti. Over here, you have the blue cycads that I mentioned. These are Encephalatos horridus. Both are from South Africa. And interestingly, they actually get more blue if the weather is cooler, right? But even in our kind of weather, they still have that blue, sort of blue tone. But it does get more blue in colder weather. And then you have these sort of xeric trees. So this one is called the Decaya madagascariensis. And the interesting thing about this plant is it's only got one species in its genus, right? And this is it. So it's from Madagascar. And then you have all the other sort of trees. These trees, can tolerate a lot drier conditions. But even with the sort of weather that we get, the rain, you can still tolerate. Right. Then in terms of seed-grown trees, it's basically all these that you see on top. Yeah. So many of these are found in the Arabian Peninsula, like in Socotra, in Somalia, and Madagascar. I would say, the first thing you always start off with are the largest plants, so the trees, right? Because once you plant them, you can't move them. I've learned that, with this garden, that, in my mind, what are the trees that are sort of like, I made notes of them and then decide where I sort of want to put them. And then from there, you start to then think about everything else. Obviously, trees are also tricky because if you plant the wrong trees, in the long term, it can be quite a costly mistake. So I've had that, where some trees that I've planted, I realized actually have buttress roots that can destroy infrastructure, right? Because of that, I had to get them removed. The tree cutters had to come in and literally chop off the trees. I planted these fern trees, which are really tall trees that you see the end parks. In the past, used to plant a lot of. I had one leaning quite close to the neighbor, so I had to make that decision to just remove it. Yeah, so that kind of consideration, I would say are mistakes that you sort of learn, right? And then, in the next time, if I ever have to plant a new garden, okay, I know, right? What are the trees that I should plant, shouldn't plant, and then what's a good substitute. But I would say for the rest of the garden, once you have the trees in place, then you can start to then sort of figure out, what goes sort of where. And sometimes if you grow them in pots, you can actually move them around. When you feel that that's not the right place, you sort of move them around. So this is a tree that's native to Singapore, called Cranthoxylum cochichilensis. And it's related to a tree more commonly known as the pink Mamba, right? So when it blooms, it produces a lot of pink flowers. Some people call it the Singapore's version of the sakura. One thing good about planting trees in a garden, if you're an aroid collector, is you can let the aroids climb up the trees naturally. So you can see, you have golden dragon, you have monsteras, you have philodendron, right? Syngoniums. Everything is climbing this tree. And as we move along, this is an area where I put a lot of my monsteras, and I'm actually letting them grow on the wall, and they look pretty happy doing that. So this is something which quite a lot of people will be familiar with right now. It's called a Syzygium juhoi. I think, it used to be a plant that I never thought I would ever get, because it's one of those plants that if you buy overseas, it's very difficult to ship, and because you cannot bare root the plant. When you disturb the roots, it will definitely die, right? But then Sindo made it possible, right? Because don't ask me how they do it, but they managed to bring in the trees with the root ball intact. And I think that made a lot of difference. And over the COVID period, a lot of people started to get this. And this is the size you get right now. I think a lot of it you obviously can read up, but then I think every person's sort of growing conditions at home differs, because your area might be, you might stay in a condo that is a lot higher up, there's a lot more airflow, things dry out quickly, so you can't say that, don't water so frequently. You might actually need to water more because they dry out a lot faster. So trial and error is one of the best ways to learn. Sometimes a very expensive way to learn, but then I think it's also it's one of those areas where, okay, you remember this is something that I should not do. So this is the back garden, I think, where I call it the jungle of the house, because it feels like one. So when I moved in, this was just grass, all grass, right? And then I started to plant the trees. So everything you see here about 12 years old. So I have this garden, which I had for the last 11 years. And then I've also have a plot at Seletar, which I must have been there for about 3 years, I think. The reason I have a plot is because sometimes there are certain plants that I can't provide the right conditions at home. So for example, where I live is quite near the sort of the highway. And because it's near the highway, actually it dries out pretty quickly, right? The humidity is not as high as you think it would be. At the plot, it's a much smaller space, right? So it's basically like a greenhouse. You can fix misters in, and then you can regulate the watering, and you basically regulate the moisture so that the conditions are constant. Also, when growing in a sort of garden setting, the sunlight is not always constant because you have trees, right, you have branches blocking the sunlight. So it's not always consistent. When you're trying to grow seedlings, for example, you need an area where there's constant sunlight, constant moisture, uniform throughout, right? Which I cannot, again, replicate at home because I don't have that space or setup for it. At a plot, I can put a table, right? I can put trays of seedlings. It gets fixed sunlight from a certain time of the day it is a lot more uniform in that sense, and I can control the conditions a lot better than I can do at home. Okay, so this is the main garden of the house, and it's also the area where I mentioned earlier it gets less humidity, mainly because it's right next to the highway. You can hear the noise. So when you live right next to the highway, you get quite a lot of wind, right? And because of that, it does bring down, or rather, it does dry up the area a lot quicker. So there are certain types of aeroids that I can't really grow well here due to that, right? So I either put them in the sort of the shade house where I can control the misting, and then for less sensitive aeroids, I can put them out here, right? So like this Anthurium hookerii hybrid, right? It does well without too much moisture, right? Surprisingly, this one, the Billetier, also can do without, too much of moisture. Okay, this is where I grow most of my aeroids, I would say, especially the Anthuriums. I put them here because I can actually control the moisture, because I actually have misters installed. So because you guys were coming, I actually had to scrub the roof, so it's a lot brighter. Previously, there was a lot of algae growing on the roof and a lot of fallen dried leaves that I had to sweep off. So this week I actually went up there and I scraped it off, and it looks a lot brighter. But it's good you guys come, because then the plants benefit from that as well. So one of the things I enjoy doing in this area is actually to hybridize the Anthuriums. This is a Kala Blackii. It's a red crystal that is going to produce seed. Even monsteras like this one also flowering as well. I've not yet tried to cross a monstera, but hope to do so one day. Yep. So through trial and error, you sometimes learn sort of new things, right? And one of the things I learned is some species of Anthuriums actually do okay where the weather conditions are a little bit drier. So Clarinevium is one of them. I found that this one has been here for, I would say, 3 years now, and it seems to be quite happy, constantly flowering, very low maintenance sort of Anthurium. One of the things I enjoy growing in the garden is actually palms, because palm trees are really great for aeroids to climb on. Some palms, like the acai palm, acai as in the thing that you eat, are clumping palms, so they actually produce quite a lot of trunks, right? And then with each trunk, you can attach different aeroids to it, right? So there are going to be a lot. Like right here, I have this Yopii that I've attached to this trunk for, 4 years now? So if you look up, right, you will see a whole mess over there, and that's basically the Philodendron micans. It's not like the micans that you are more accustomed to, which is a small velvety leaves, with a bit of reddish tinge. Mature micans actually loses its velvetiness, and then it's just a very nice green heart-shaped leaf. So when philodendrons are allowed to climb, that's when they will really get big. Paraiso verde is another example. That's why I'm also letting the Patriciae climb. Right, so it's starting to climb already. Yeah, see, this is a moss pole from Marcus. To me, it's like a starter kit, right? To allow the plant to get onto a real moss pole, which is a tree. In this case, it's a palm. Tips on how to grow a jungle. Patience. Yeah, I think patience is a key thing, because it takes time for plants to grow. Get understanding the kind of plants that you want to use in your gardenscape. is important because different plants have different requirements and some grow faster than others. So patience, for example, when you want to grow trees, I think you have to be very patient because they will take years, to reach maturity, right? So that is probably one of the key things. Knowing the conditions for each plant is also an important factor. And of course, regular maintenance, right? So right down from pruning to, fertilizing. The other thing that I really hate is de-weeding because there's so much weeds, right? They grow so quickly, especially during the wet season. It just takes a few days of rain and then you see, all the weeds around, and that's a real pain to deal with. Yeah.